Welcome to the Growth Boss Podcast, where we seek out the secrets to high-performing campaigns from some of the smartest marketers in the world. I'm your host, Jared Smith. Today, I have Nick Bradley with me, and he's going to talk to us about how he created over $5 billion in value and guided over 50 acquisitions. Nick is a world-renowned author, speaker, and business growth expert who helps entrepreneurs, leaders, and investors build, scale, and sell high-value companies. With over a decade in private equity, he has completed 50-plus acquisitions, sold 26 businesses, and created more than $5 billion in value, including 3 exits worth over $1 billion each. Nick's mission is to level the playing field for business owners, equipping them with the tools and strategies to scale efficiently, compete with private equity buyers, and achieve exceptional exits. Nick, thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, Jared, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, awesome. So the place I'd really like to start, because I've heard that you have a specialty here in terms of turning around struggling companies. And even though, I think about some of my companies, I have a couple companies, some of them are doing well, some of them aren't doing as well. Even the ones that are doing well, there's still a tremendous area for improvement. So I'd really like to hear from you either a couple of stories or kind of principles that you use when you dive into a company and you're looking to kind of turn it around, you're looking to optimize it. Kind of where do you start with that process?
Yeah, let's get into this. This will be fun. So for context for everyone listening, my background was in private equity, but I did a few different things. I wasn't the finance guy. I was the business operator. I was a CEO 4 times under private equity investment. And I had a reputation for going into companies that were struggling in order to fix them, scale them, and then obviously sell them for a lot more money. That's how all the private equity investors get paid, right? So relatively important stuff. I look at businesses in a very simple way. And I think there are certain principles and fundamentals that every business has to have. And certainly if you're at scale stage, right? Because when you start a business, Jared, right? It's quite chaotic, it's fun. You've got to see if you've got a product or a service that's actually going to sell. I'm talking about what happens after that. And the stage after that, I call it scale stage, but it's the stage where you suddenly have to start employing people. It's not just you running everything anymore. You've got the complexities of kind of other personalities, and you've got to have the ego get sort of, drop down because you're employing people that are better than you, all that sort of stuff. So when I look at a business, to answer your question, I look at it through the lens of you've got to have, the right people in the right seats. You've got to be a great leader of people, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're not going to be able to build your business without hiring people, you're not going to have much of a business, regardless of the AI stuff that's coming our way. You've got that piece. Then you've got profit. Most people talk about revenue, and I often look at revenue as vanity. You need to have it, but unless you've got the ability to turn profit into cash, then, nothing else really matters. And then the final piece is what I call your value proposition. Like sometimes it's called your business model. And I see more businesses failing and having to be fixed, not because of marketing, not because of sales, because of poor business models. And so once you get that kind of optimized and working, everything else clicks into place. So when I go and turn around a company or get involved, I kind of look at those, have you got the right people in the right seats? Are they working to processes? Have you got the right business model that is scalable, as well as, can it generate the right level of profitability for you to be sustainable?
Okay, amazing. I want to dig into each one of those, starting with getting the right people in the right seats. You get into a company, you're CEO, the company's been around for 5-10 years. How are you evaluating the people? Are you looking at kind of the manager's notes who's been managing them, or how are you measuring the output, the effectiveness of these people?
The first thing you look at when you go into a company, particularly from a kind of fixing or turnaround perspective, is you look at the numbers. Right? You look at what data is available to you. So you don't start with the people, you start with what the metrics are giving you. So, and sometimes that means looking at the profit and loss statement and obviously the balance sheet, the kind of financial instruments. But I'm more interested to see if people actually know what their business is doing, right? How are you winning business? How many leads are coming into your business? What are your percentages of conversion? What's the cost of acquisition? So I look at all those metrics because what that will tell me across the main functions of a business, which areas are broken. Right. So that's the first thing. Right. So I'm not talking to anybody at this point. I'm looking at the numbers. Second thing I'm looking at is how intentional the culture is in a business. And this is one of the things that I know a lot of business owners think is really ethereal, right? Our culture doesn't matter. I've worked in some businesses where the culture is probably the most important thing because it drives all the performance. And we can get into what that looks like. But if you've got a business where that's not really clearly defined, and normally it comes from a really clear vision as well. So this is where we're taking the business and these are the values that are going to enable that. If those things aren't in place, then quite frankly, you don't really know what the quality of the people is like, because you might have great people, but the culture is not defined. So those people aren't operating to their full potential, right?
Yeah.
And then the last thing I look at is the organizational design. So the org chart, as it's called. And that's when I start to look at the roles that have been defined in the business that's trying to drive the growth and the strategy. And then I start to look at the individuals after that. So three different layers of kind of making sure you have got the right capability in your business.
Okay. Can you share an example where you took over a company, the culture was not well defined? It was not intentional, and the steps that you took to make it intentional and to make sure it was clear where the company needed to go so that you could actually determine, hey, do we have the right people to take the company to where it needs to go?
Sure. And before I get into that detail, because I want to get practical here for everyone listening, right? When a private equity firm buys a company, we normally designate that company into two different lanes. One is called a prize, the other is called a prey. Now, the best way to think of this, simplest way to think of this, is like a bit of a sort of housing analogy.
Okay.
The prize is when you buy the house and it's beautifully done up. It's painted well. There's nothing you need to do. You just need to move in and it's just easy, right?
Yep.
In business, the prize business has got, all of the infrastructure in place. It's got a great defined culture. It's kind of got the right people. And all we're going to do now is take those resources, if you like, those assets, and we're going to scale them. So from an investor standpoint, we love that because it's easy, but we're going to pay more for that company.
Yep.
The prey, on the other hand, is usually a bit of a mess. Like it might have some assets, but it hasn't got things in place. It definitely hasn't got a strong defined brand or culture. The numbers are all over the place. We like those companies too because they're the turnaround companies. They're the ones where I'm going to go and fix them and then make more money because I'm going to buy them cheap. Right? That's why we call them the prey. So to give you an example, I've done this multiple times, but I'll give you a live example of this. So I was involved in a HR, human resources services business. I was jettisoned in to be the sort of almost like a fractional CEO. Initially, I was really just assessing the business, but then I ended up becoming the CEO of this company. And what I mean by not having a defined culture is people do things randomly. They don't know the sort of code of conduct of how to treat customers. They probably don't really know how to treat themselves, right? In terms of that, it can be a little bit of a zoo. That's the extreme example of that. And what you'll find, evidence of this is classic one, a great salesperson, the highest biller in the company, but they're an arsehole, okay? But no one wants to fire that person because, they're bringing all the money in, right? Classic example. You would have heard that before. So in this situation, we had that person, by the way. Now, the problem here, right, is that when you lead a business, certainly one that's becoming scale stage or bigger, and you're that founder, there's lots of people looking at you and looking at the decisions you're making, and they're deciding, particularly the good people, they're deciding if they're going to stick around based on how good you are as a leader of that business. So if you tolerate poor performance, if you tolerate the egos, all those sort of things, the good people leave. So this is how you fix it. So the first thing you do when you go into a situation like that, where you might have really good people who do fit the culture, but again, the culture is undefined, so you don't know. Equally, you've got people there who are probably not the right people for the reasons I said beforehand. You've got to do two main things. First and foremost, you have to go deep into the vision. So if a vision hasn't been created, and normally I look at a vision sort of 3 years out, it's not just the commercials in the business, it's kind of where we're going. And so you reverse engineer from what that business looks like, what your business looks like 3 years from now. And you do it to an incredible level of detail. So much so you define each department and you define what great or outstanding looks like in each department. You define what the great leader looks like in those areas, right? You start to get a sense of that. So if you're a service business like this HR business I'm talking about, we were working with large corporates. So, in that situation, we needed to have a certain way of operating that was quite corporate and professional, right? So that otherwise we couldn't resonate with that particular audience. So that's the first bit. And then you get into values. and you define the values based, there's a few ways of doing this. You don't just put nice words on a wall. So a bad value is integrity in terms of it's just a word. A great value is raising the bar, or make it fun, or things that you can define into actual behaviors, and you can measure, hire, fire, and incentivize.
Okay.
So you've got to put those things into the business pretty quickly if you've got one, if that doesn't exist.
Yeah. I love that you break down the vision for each department and even for each leader. I think, as an entrepreneur, I just think about like, hey, I want to come up with a vision that's really enticing for me, but I don't break it down to explain what it means for every person in the organization. And it's like, yeah, that totally, they can relate to it. It should resonate right with them. And then they can act upon it, as opposed to just something that the top guy is like, hey, this is kind of where we're going. Everybody kind of get in line.
Well, it has three main jobs. And this is why I like to impress this on people when I talk about vision, because most people think it's not that important. But the three main jobs are, firstly, if you ever want to sell your company one day, right, the first question like a private equity firm is going to ask you is, show me the vision. And they're asking the question not to prove that you've got one. They want to take the asset that you've built and they want to be able to scale it. So the clearer that vision is and the clearer the story is, and they want to be excited by that because they're going to bring their resources, which is their strategies and their finance, their capital, to that vision. Right? They don't create the vision. They just want to scale it. Yep. Second thing is you use it to hire and fire, but you do it in a really, really clever way. So whenever I'm hiring someone who's quite senior, sort of manager level and above, I make sure that the vision document is sent in the interview process. And when we're interviewing, we talk about the vision. Here's the ninja trick. Yeah. If someone leans in, once they've read the vision, you're interviewing them, and they're excited by it, when you ask the questions, you're getting the cultural fit right. If someone doesn't really care, then straight away you're going to save a lot of money and time by not making that hiring decision. Yeah. Okay. And 100%. Then the third thing is you can use it with customers. So a really clear vision that has, a mission and values aligned to it can be a powerful brand differentiator, which means working with you is different from someone else, and that can affect your pricing. So you can charge more simply because you've got a unique and differentiated brand that's a result of being clear on your vision. So three really practical things that I think most business owners can learn from that process for sure.
Agreed. Now, one of the things you touched on in the hiring process is incentivizing the right people, right? And talk to me a little bit about your philosophy and how you guys have implemented that.
Yeah, so one of the things I find is, let's talk about like the big thing that people hate talking about, which is equity and ownership, because that's the one where people kind of get confused. Yeah. My philosophy, because I come from that world of private equity, my philosophy is that if you can have people think and operate like business owners, particularly your senior people around you, they start to have a different way of operating within the business, right? So I'm a big believer in giving out equity to senior people. Now that can be protected through things like options, investing and things like that. But I believe that if you get someone great who's going to help you enable that vision, you want them to be locked and loaded on whatever your ultimate outcome is. Now, a lot of the outcomes I work to is selling the company for 8 or 9 figures for people. So you want someone that's also going to be rewarded for that journey, right? Yeah. But I think there are obviously different ways of incentivizing, not always money. But in the majority, right, you've still got to have fantastic, pay that's market comparable. I do love performance bonuses, and then, as I said, I think equity and options at the right level is something that most business owners need to look at, particularly again when they're scaling.
And I think one of the concerns I've had in the past with giving out equity is just, how much time do I need to have with somebody to determine if they're worth the equity that I'm going to give them? And then once I've done that, and okay, now my fear would be that they would run off. Hey, thanks. I've got 5% of the company, whatever. I'm going to go move on to my next thing. Starting kind of with the first bit of that, like, is there like a 6-month assessment period when you come into a company where you're trying to figure out like, hey, is this somebody I want to give equity to? Or is it just right off the bat, hey, you've been in the company, we're going to give you equity and let's go build this?
It depends on the seniority of the role. And it depends a little bit on your philosophy as an owner. So you might, and again, we're talking a lot here, equity becomes really valuable when you're going to sell your company one day. Having equity in a business where you're just doing profit shares can be valuable, But more often than not, you're better off just doing performance bonuses with people, right? One of the most important things here, depending on if you think about how a business is valued, is that if you pay bonuses and salary, it comes off the P&L, okay? Now, when you sell a company, it's a multiple of profit. So the more that you're taking away from the profitability of the business, you're actually, it's not just a few $100,000, it might be a few million, depending on what you're doing. If someone has equity in the business, then that doesn't affect that. Okay, so just another little ninja trick for people.
Yeah, because they're taking it as a distribution, you're saying, right?
Yeah, it's a distribution. So if you look at EBITDA, right, it comes out of that. But the other thing is, there's also a thing that if you have equity, it's almost a bit of delayed gratification. Like you're working collectively, right, unified towards a big outcome, which is normally a big exit. So your payday is coming later. And the reason, I'm going to answer your two questions specifically. So the reason why I think equity is a fantastic lever at a certain level, and this is normally when you're building your more senior team around you, is that if you want to bring in the philosophy of, bring people in that are better than you, but also bring people in that can, have done the thing that you're trying to do, they're usually quite expensive. And quite often, sometimes they come from larger businesses where they don't have the option to be owners. So you can use equity to incentivize people into your business so you don't have to pay them as much. You're giving them something that they couldn't get elsewhere. But because there's this big event that's going to happen, remember, you want that event to happen too. You can be quite strategic around getting a higher caliber person into your business doing that. Last point, because you said about how do I know when? Vesting in options is the answer to that. So options are kind of shares that you get allocated, but you don't really have any real ownership. They're kind of allocated to you, but there are terms and conditions around those. Vesting is a way of realizing the shares that you have in a company, but you don't get them straight away. So vesting is really a time-based allocation, if you want to define it. So you might say, listen, you're going to get this amount of equity when you join, or it might be zero. If after 12 months you've done these things, we're going to allocate another 5% or whatever the figure is. So it might be that someone sticks around with you for say 3 or 4 years before they get a full allocation of equity. And then you can also protect yourself that if they do certain things, they leave to go to a competitor or whatever, that you can have clawbacks on that equity. So the reason obviously that's a detailed conversation, but the reason I think it's important is that most business owners think that they're giving up something from the outset, and if it doesn't work, they're in trouble. That can happen if you don't know what you're doing and you don't have really good legal advice around it. So you've got to make sure you've got that at the very minimum.
Very good. Nick, I want to understand, as somebody who has hired a lot of leaders and you've led a number of companies, what do you feel that it takes to become an exceptional leader?
Great question. Love this question. So when I started my podcast, which was called Scale Up Your Business back in 2019, I said, I think almost in the first episode, I said, you can only scale a business to the level of your identity. And what I meant by that really was a few different things, but it was really the transition from a startup business to a scale stage business to one that could be, exited for millions. And how you evolve as a leader through that journey, to be honest, really defines how far you go on that journey, right? And sometimes you see this happening with large, corporates where a fantastic startup founder who's fantastic in that first, say up to 2 million of revenue, as soon as they start bringing more complexity around them, they can't do it anymore and they have to replace themselves, right? You might have seen that. So I think here's the key thing. Someone who's great at the beginning normally is creative, normally is innovative, relentless, a bit of a control freak. There are sometimes narcissistic tendencies, not always.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But they have to be at the forefront. Once you start to scale, the only way you can scale is with people and process. Okay, so you have to drop the ego. I always say ego is the biggest killer of scale stage.
Yeah.
Because you have to be able to realize people are better than you, right, at things.
Yeah.
And you have to have an ability to trust. Okay. The way I found that people have developed great leadership all the way through is, first and foremost, they get themselves in different rooms. So I've had a philosophy of always putting myself, every single quarter, I'll put myself into a different room based on 3 things. Either I want to learn a new skill, put myself into a new network to create different relationships. But quite often I want to put myself into an environment where I feel a bit scared and intimidated. As
a humility driver or for another reason?
I think what it does, a great insight, yes, because what it does is it makes me realize that I'm still just a person who's learning and growing. And that humility comes back because what you start to realize, if you put yourself in a room of people who have scaled businesses to 8 or 9 figures and you've only built your business to a few million, and you start asking questions around it, you start to realize that there's a different level that you have to play at. And then you also start to realize the gaps in your leadership, which could be very practical things, but it's the awareness of that and the ability to evolve and change, which allows, I think, a great leader to build a, potentially $1 billion business. But it's the ones that get in their own way and don't appreciate that that's what it takes are the ones that fail. And the last point I'll say, classic analogy about we all have that internal thermostat, right? And the reason I said about challenging my comfort zone is if I just keep doing the same things I'm doing, I'm never growing. And what I find is my businesses, back to identity, they stall back to that level as well.
Yeah. This makes a lot of sense. The thing that's coming to my mind as we're talking about this, because I was like, man, you seem like a really great leader. And I'm like, I'm trying to process, why do I feel that way? And when I look at the times in my life where I've been frustrated as, somebody who's following somebody else, so I'm not the main leader, it's normally because of a lack of clarity. It's a lack of clarity of where we're going or how we're going to get there. However that looks, there's a level of confusion. There's a level of lack of clarity. And the thing that I appreciate about you, and I'm sure everybody that's worked with you has appreciated, is everything's very clear. You know exactly, and again, you may not understand this when you jump into the business the first, day, but at some point you're gonna be like, okay, here's where we're going. Here's how we're going to get there. Here are the values that are important as an organization. And I'm just curious, like, how do you bring people along for that ride when you're delivering these things? Obviously you're getting in the rooms, you're understanding where the organization is right now, but are you asking them like, hey, where do you think we should be going? Is this a collaborative thing, or is this you kind of getting in there, understanding, writing it down, and then delivering it to the team?
It's more the latter.
Okay.
It's definitely more the latter. So there is a collaboration piece. I mean, the worst thing you can do, particularly in a turnaround situation, is go in there and have too much assumed knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean, usually you do have knowledge because you're going into a situation where someone's putting you in there. Usually it's an investor and they're like, this is what I think the situation is. You've got to diagnose it for yourself. So the first part is going out there and just really understanding it. Hence why we start with the numbers. Like before I go into, even walk into a business or start talking to anyone in the business, I start looking at the data. I start looking at things like Trustpilot reviews. I start looking at kind of anything I can look at to build a picture of the business. And I suppose once you've been doing this for a while and you've had the failures as well as you've had the wins, you've seen a lot of things. I've sat around multiple board tables in my time and I've seen horrific leadership. I've seen brilliant leadership. So you start to model and pattern that as well. You start to see what's effective. But I think in answer to your question again, so, the clarity comes from experience. It comes from knowing that there is, everything we're talking about here is a bit of a playbook, Jared, to be honest, right? It comes from muscle memory of going in and having failures in situations where I've maybe been too presumptive in the past and I haven't sort of, gone in there and sort of read the room. It comes from thinking that I know what the strategy should be without talking to any customers. And so the clarity comes from, not trying to feel that you know everything, but having the confidence that you know enough of the things that are going to make a difference because it has worked with you over the years to be able to pull those things out of your toolkit when needed.
Okay.
Right? That's what it comes down to. In great leadership, you're right. There is composure and clarity around it, but I think that all stems from, doing the yards, right? And being in the trenches. That really what I suppose I've done over, I'm now 51. I've been doing this for 30 odd years. So, there's a lot of muscle memory in those years, I can tell you.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Let's talk about the topic of scaling. You dive in, you're understanding the numbers, figuring out which levers to pull. Let's kind of start on the marketing side of things, marketing and sales. How do you determine, hey, let's push a little harder on this channel. Let's open up some new channels. Kind of what does that process development look like?
With marketing, so I'm going to start with business model and then we'll get into marketing. Because as I said, beforehand, I think sometimes the business model of a company is not working. Yeah. And there are 5 sort of key parts to the business model. The first part is the customer piece, right? Who are we serving? Why does it matter? Then you're kind of going into the value proposition, the thing you're actually selling, right? Which is actually more than just a product or service. It's the whole experience. Then you get into the revenue engine, so the go-to-market stuff. Then you get into delivery, and then you finally get into operational excellence. So all of those are kind of things that you can assess, okay? 5 different factors. if you don't understand, and I've got a sheet that I use with 15 questions actually that goes through all of those, and we just ask questions around it to get to clarity. So do that first, right? Get really clear to make sure that's there. When you get into the marketing, right? For me, it depends on the business and it depends on what the overall objective is. Sometimes in businesses, it's not about growth. It's about maximizing profitability. So in situations like that, from a broader marketing context, we might look at customer profitability and product profitability, and we might actually turn off customer segments, or we might even turn off products that we think are not going to achieve the outcome. So that's quite strategic. Yeah. When we look at growth, right, again, we analyze what we believe the metrics need to be. And if we do lots of experiments as well. We experiment lots of things. It could be messaging. It could be how much we're spending on ads on certain channels. It could be a content strategy, whatever it is. Once we start to see that there's evidence, very small amounts of evidence, we double down on those lanes. But the key thing is we don't do too many things. So I normally say in a business that's high value, it has 2 to 3 core customer acquisition channels. And we look to scale those channels through some sort of build, buy, or partner strategy. Okay. So what that effectively means, right, is, we're either going to build the machine ourselves, we're going to partner to access the machine, or we're going to acquire it. And again, in private equity and the stuff that I do, a lot of the time, we will acquire sort of commercial growth engines as needed, because it's quicker sometimes to do that, at least to try and build it ourselves.
No, I was just going to say, I would love to hear a couple examples of that. Like when I think about like some of the main channels in the digital marketing world, things like SEO, yep, things like Facebook, on the SEO side, I mean, I can think of a lot of really good acquisitions. Like HubSpot has been good at acquiring either properties that rank well or properties that have a nice audience. But I think I would love to hear, I think maybe some of my audience may not understand all the different opportunities that may be available to them. So maybe you could share like an example or two where you went in and kind of acquired almost a new channel to help grow the business.
Yeah, so I mean, I've got a digital agency where I'll talk about in terms of agencies, because I think it's an important thing. We do a lot of what is called acqui-hire. So we'll go and, if you haven't heard this term, anyone listening, that's where you go and acquire a company because you want the people, right? Yeah. So we focus a lot on paid media, but we've just bought a sales enablement agency by acquiring the person. So that's another way of thinking about how can you expand your business, right, by buying the person. The other thing that we've done is we do a lot of joint ventures and partnerships where we bring the growth engine, the marketing side of that, but someone else has got the product or service, and we'll take either a joint venture approach or equity within that person. We're really buying the person and the idea, but we're going to scale it. Yep. So we've done that recently with a LinkedIn group where they've got an incredible LinkedIn capability in terms of what they do. In fact, one of the best around. And we can drive the right quality of customer to them. And we'll take a profit share plus potentially some equity in that agency going forward. Okay. So does that make sense? So that's kind of a bit more expansive ways of thinking of this. I mean, obviously most people go out there and just try and find customers and sell them a product. Where we do that, of course we do. But we also try and think about how we can use the other levers of that build, buy, and partner philosophy I mentioned before, which actually grows both the value as well as the profitability and the expansion of that business. We're trying to make it more valuable through thinking a bit more holistic.
Yeah, I like that. If somebody wanted to do kind of an acqui-hire approach, and I could see that being really valuable when you have maybe a more traditional entrepreneur that's great with the vision, great at sales, driving growth, but they're not as great on the delivery side. And they meet somebody who's running a phenomenal agency. Maybe they're lacking all the business, but they have all the processes. They run a phenomenal organization. Like, is there kind of a go-to multiple that you pay for those? Is it based on revenue, based on profit? Maybe you could take us behind the curtain a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big opportunity for businesses like that now is to find the people who can't scale their own companies and bring them into your ecosystem. Because as long as they've got assets, and that could be their brand, it could be their product or service, it could be their customer base. We've done acqui-hires where we just want to go into a territory, like Australia, for example, and we've gone out there and got someone in and created almost like a federation model. I'll explain what that is in a second. But the idea being, sometimes we won't even pay cash. What we will do is guarantee a certain income, we'll guarantee a certain performance bonus. And back to, what we talked about with options and equity, we do that because we say, okay, we're going to give you a percentage of this thing. And our goal is to exit the whole group at some point. So there's no way that you will be able to do that with your small little business. No one's going to buy that, right? No one's going to give you any money for it. So why don't you join us? and then you at least get a liquidity event in the future. So businesses, and to answer your question specifically, businesses that say under 500K of revenue, in my opinion, are just jobs, right? Still could sound like a lot of money to a smaller business, but actually when you think about it, there's not a lot to play with, particularly in there. Once you start getting over the 7 figures of revenue and you've got a few $100,000 of profit, it's starting to get more interesting. Where the game really starts to get played from a sell your business for a lot of money is when you start to get over $1 million of net profit or EBITDA. And normally you have to have a business that's doing somewhere between 3 to 5 million of revenue to be able to reach that goal. When you're at that level, you could sell your business for anywhere north of 5 to 10 million. And it's usually off a profit multiple, not a revenue multiple. Years ago, it used to be more like that, but those days are gone. And it's more about focusing on how profitable and efficient you can make your business if that's the goal.
I love it. Okay, I want to start delving more into the exit side, so we have a little time for that. Talk to me about, probably a couple years leading up to that eventual exit. What are the things that you're doing to maximize the business, to make sure that you're in an optimal position to sell for whatever the highest multiple could be for your industry? Again, kind of looking at this a couple years in advance, and maybe start by sharing, like, how many years in advance should a business owner be thinking about this? I mean, are they thinking about this on day one? Or are they thinking about this like 2 to 3 years, 5 years? Like, when should they be thinking about it?
So you're asking the wrong person, because I'm going to say from day one.
Yeah.
This is a great thing to talk about because I want to be real with people listening to this. So there are really, in my opinion, 2 lanes of business, right? You have the lifestyle business, as it's called, and you have what I call the performance business. Now, the definition, right, is lifestyle business really means any money that business makes, I'm going to take out and it's going to fund my lifestyle. Mm-hmm. I'm not really that interested in growth necessarily. If I am, putting money back into the business, I'm thinking, I could have bought something with that, right? Now, that's all about immediate gratification, but there's no real equity value being built in that business. There can be, and sometimes a lifestyle business can become a performance business, but generally speaking, it's the philosophy of that owner. Yeah. Performance business is the opposite, obviously. It's delayed gratification. I'm putting as much as I can into the growth of this business so that I can sell it for a lot of money, okay? Yep. So in that situation, it changes the philosophy a little bit of kind of how you think about things and what you do. So let's talk just about the performance side. My opinion is you reverse engineer from a number. So if you said to me, Jared, I want to sell my business for $20 million, I would say to you, okay, let's just look at what that needs to look like from a financial perspective and a strategic perspective to get that number. If you said, I want to sell it for 100 million, I would say, okay, let's do it. So there's no cap necessarily on the number as long as you're prepared to have a timeline to achieve it and you're prepared to be flexible about how your business model changes. Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, so I've seen businesses start tiny and get massive quickly because they've changed their business model. Equally, I've seen people have said, I want to sell my business for 9 figures. They might only be doing, 1 to 2 million of net profit. If they can get that net profit from 1 to 2 million up to, say, 10 to 12, I can pretty much guarantee that they're going to have it depends on the industry, but pretty much have a 9-figure exit, right? So their goal is really just to increase their profitability to 10 million. So how long does this all take? It depends on those factors. But I say that if you're preparing your business for sale and you've got a certain amount of profit already that's close to the number that you would want to achieve, it's going to be multiplied by the multiple, as we say, and then it's going to give you the number. So it's usually somewhere between 24 to 36 months. Okay. So 2 years of what I call optimization, build and optimization, and then the sales process at the end normally takes anywhere between 9 to 12 months. But you don't start the sales process at all until you are certain that you've done enough of the build and the optimization to get to your number. Okay, that's fantastic. Okay, let's dig into the negotiation process. So you've hit the 2-year mark. You're like, this business is as optimized as I can get it, right? For all the things that I know, for what I'm looking to put into it, I've got it where I want it. I'm ready to begin that process. What's the first step? So the whole thing has started already, right? So the point is, like, you've done, the vision for the business that we spoke about, that's an incredibly important thing to sell. So that's locked down, right? You've already done due diligence on your business before you've gone to market. So it's a little bit like doing an assessment on a house and you're looking for subsidence or whatever. You've already fixed all those issues, right? So in that situation, you've got a few options. I personally, depending on what the number is and what we think the best acquirer is for your business, I actually like to shop the business a little bit before starting an official sales process. And the way that you do that is you find 5 to 10 ideal acquirers, people that you would love to sell the business to, but because and this works brilliantly if you're selling to another company more so than a private equity firm. You start to do a strategic partnership with them, right? So you reverse engineer your strategy into their strategy, and you provide a capability that it's going to take them more time or money to do themselves. Bonus points if they're an acquisitive company already. And here's the real, again, I'm going to do another ninja trick for everyone. Because there's so much money in private equity, if you want to sell your business for 8 or 9 figures by say 2030, 80% of that's going to have private equity involvement. And so even if you sell your business to another company, there's an idiot like me sitting at the top telling the CEO of that company to buy businesses, right? True.
Yeah.
So you know how this all works. It's pretty clever, right? So what you do is you go and find 5 to 10 businesses in your industry that are private equity backed. Start to build a relationship with them. You provide something that's quite unique but valuable to them. You start to make money from that. Someone on the side of the table goes, why are we making them more valuable? Why don't we just buy them? And quite often a great deal can happen without a process.
Yeah.
Really fun, right? And you can get paid a lot of money. I know,
Yeah.
It's fun, isn't it? I know. I always advise that with the businesses I work with. I say, look, why don't we just start with that? Like, you can always say no, but you're going to grow your business anyway, so who cares, right?
Yeah.
The second thing is, like, if you want to run a process, I don't love investment bankers and brokers very well. I think if you've got the right team around you and you build like what is called a deal team in that sort of 12 months before you go to market, you can run a lot of this yourself. It is important to go and get people sort of fighting and bidding for your business. It's good to get a bit of competition. But what I hate is these old traditional processes where you go to, say, a broker and they send you out to 300 people on their email list or whatever it is. And the whole, you do what's called the dog and pony show. You're out there having conversations with all these people. And it's just an old, really boring way of doing it. So it's a lot, for me, that's a last resort. And businesses that are kind of that prey, not very good business, they're the ones who have to resort to that because they haven't been strategic in some of the stuff that we've talked about already.
So you talked about kind of building that deal team. What does that team look like if they're not investment bankers and brokers, kind of the traditional route?
Yeah, so I mean, I do a bit of it in terms of like M&A advisory. So you get people like me who are not necessarily consultants per se, but they're people that have kind of done the thing that you've wanted to do. I always say you need to have a really strong finance person around you. Some businesses have already got that in. Sometimes I put a lot of fractional CFOs into businesses that have already been in sort of investor-backed environments. So they know how to build the financials in a way that are going to be beautifully presented to that more sophisticated acquirer. The other one is obviously an incredibly good deal attorney, someone who has transaction experience. Because when you sell a company, certainly to a third party, be that another company or a financial buyer, there are 2 things that matter, price and terms. And you can only win one. And my strong advice to anyone is win terms. So even if you take a smaller price, if you get the best terms around that, you're probably going to be more happier, but you're also going to make more money. So if I go back to my private equity days, if someone says, hey, I just want the highest valuation, I'm just going to screw you on the terms, right? I'm going to put earnouts in there and all these crazy things, which means you're not going to probably ever get those. Whereas, if I say actually take 5% off, it might be a bit of money, but if I'm going to enjoy it, I'm going to get it, and it's the right partner, it's definitely worth that, in my opinion.
Yeah. Give us maybe a couple of quick examples before we close on the terms that we should be looking for. Because again, as somebody like me who doesn't have a lot of experience selling companies, I don't even know what options are available. I've sold one company, 5 years ago, and I was actually thinking,
well, that's good though. I mean, that's something.
Yeah.
I mean, like, at least you understand a bit of it. Most people when I speak to them, like, didn't have a great experience, and more often they're like, oh wow, I wish I'd known this stuff beforehand. I mean, terms. So I'll give you some. The best thing I say to people actually is, you remember that movie, it wasn't called the Facebook movie, but there's a bit where I think it's. One of the guys goes into a room and he signs some documents and he's really giving up all of his stake in Facebook.
Yes.
Yeah, everyone remembers it because it's like a really painful experience.
Yeah.
That's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about really, really detailed legal documents. It's called a sale and purchase agreement. And quite often there are things in that sale and purchase agreement that are written in certain ways that you might think that they're going to be offering you X, but really it's Y. That's why the legal piece gets into it. But it's things like, okay, how much of the money, it's called cash at close. How much of the money are you going to get when the deal is signed? Most people think it's everything. It's not. In private equity, it's usually about 60 to 70%, okay. Sometimes even a bit less than that. And then you go, well, hold on, I've sold my business. When am I going to get the rest of it? Well, you're going to get the rest of it over 2 to 3 years. Right. Well, what? But I don't own the business anymore. No, you don't. So they're just going to give it to me if I hang around. No. There's a thing called a performance ratchet where you have to basically deliver the numbers that you said the business would do. But I don't own the business. I can't decide that anymore. That's right.
Yeah.
So am I going to get that money? Maybe. But it's a third of what I thought I sold the business for. Yeah. Okay, that's one example. Example. There are certain things in terms of non-competes. So, you might be, more often than not, you have to non-compete in your industry for a period of time, and that makes sense. No one wants you starting another business, but there can be very onerous non-competes, decades. A decade you can't do X. Doesn't happen as much as it used to, but those things have existed in there before. One of the other ones is what we call a forced rollover, where you have equity in the business ongoing, but sometimes you don't have the same level of shares as what the acquirer has. So you can get diluted, so to speak. So there's all these different things. So these are all the examples of terms. I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but they're the watch outs of what is either going to stop you getting paid or it's going to stop you doing what you want to do. It's going to kind of compromise your freedom, which ultimately is one of the main reasons why you sell your business in the first place.
Amazing. This has been so helpful, so beneficial. I know a lot of people are going to gain a lot of value out of this. There have been so many gold nuggets in here. So Nick, I really do appreciate your time today.
It's been great, Jared. Thank you very much.
Yeah. For somebody who wants to connect with you, and maybe you could hold up your book, share a little bit about it. I assume it's on Amazon. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah. So, the book is just come out. It's called Exit for Millions. We've talked about a lot of it. Your questions have been great today. It's the private equity blueprint for scaling and selling your business for maximum value. However, we do go into just the practicals of scaling. So a lot of people say, I don't know if I want to sell my business. Well, it's really about building a great business. So yeah, you can get that from Amazon. Hit #1 bestseller in 4 categories last week. So
congratulations.
So it's been
awesome.
great. I know. So yeah. It's been fun. And then 2 other things. My podcast is called Scale Up with Nick Bradley. It's been going for 6 years, almost 400 episodes. Lots of stuff in there about leadership and some of the things that we covered today, which is great. And then LinkedIn, reach out to me on LinkedIn. You'll find me, Nick Bradley. I think it's under Real Nick Bradley is my handle on LinkedIn, but I tend to put out content every single week and all the sort of stuff that we've spoken about on the show today.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.